Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're not settling in with a king or a battlefield. Tonight we're settling in with a plant, a quiet, stubborn, endlessly misunderstood plant that has been growing alongside humanity since before we had a word for history. Cannabis. Before we drift into tonight's story, go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up. And if you're new here, feel free to say hello in the comments and tell us what time it is wherever you're listening from. It's always nice to know how far this little story is traveling tonight. Now let's slow everything down and ease into the long, smoky history of a plant that refused to be forgotten. We begin somewhere around 5000 BCE, deep in what modern maps would call Central Asia, though back then there were no maps, no borders, no names for any of it. This was the tail end of the Stone Age, a time when human beings were still figuring out the basics: how to keep a fire alive, how to keep a baby alive, how to keep both of those things from happening in the same tent. Pottery was new. Farming was new. Death by minor infection was extremely common. And somewhere in this slow, patient unfolding of civilization, a wild, scraggly plant with serrated leaves was already growing across the grasslands, doing what it always did, surviving in places where little else could. Nobody planted cannabis on purpose at first. It simply grew, the way certain plants do, in the disturbed soil around human settlements, near garbage heaps, near riverbanks, near the places where people dropped seeds without thinking about it. Botanists have a term for a plant like this. They call it a camp follower, a species that thrives specifically because humans are nearby, dropping food, disturbing the earth, creating exactly the right conditions for something hardy and opportunistic to take root. Cannabis was one of the earliest camp followers in human history, which means, in a very real sense, humanity's oldest relationship with this plant wasn't romantic or spiritual. It was accidental. It just kept showing up. At some point, someone noticed. Maybe it was the seeds, small and oily and edible enough to chew when food was scarce. Maybe it was the fibrous stalks, which twisted into cords stronger than most of what nature offered at the time. Or maybe, and this is the part that historians love to speculate about, maybe it was smoke. A handful of stems and leaves thrown onto a fire for warmth, and a very confused Stone Age forager suddenly finding the world a little softer around the edges, a little funnier, a little harder to explain to the people who hadn't inhaled any of it. We'll never know exactly who that person was, or what they thought was happening to them. There was no framework for it, no word for high, no cultural memory of anyone else ever feeling this way before. Imagine that for a second, being the very first human being to experience psychoactive effects from a plant, with absolutely no context for what was going on in your own head. You couldn't call it relaxation. You couldn't call it euphoria. The most reasonable conclusion available to a Stone Age brain was probably something like, "The fire is speaking to me," or "The spirits have opinions tonight." Which, in fairness, isn't a bad way to describe a mild high if you've truly never had one explained to you. Archaeological evidence tells us cannabis mattered to these early societies in ways that went beyond casual use. Charred cannabis seeds have been found in ancient burial sites and ceremonial pits across Central Asia and beyond, evidence that whatever this plant was doing for people, it was considered valuable enough to accompany the dead. That's not a small thing. Early humans didn't waste ritual resources. If something ended up in a grave, it was because someone believed it mattered on the other side too. But let's not get ahead of the story and turn this into pure mysticism right away, because for the first several thousand years of its relationship with humanity, cannabis wasn't primarily about visions or spirits at all. It was about rope. It was about cloth. It was about survival in the most practical, unglamorous sense. The stalks of the plant, when processed correctly, produce some of the strongest natural fiber available anywhere on Earth, fiber that could be twisted into cordage, woven into coarse fabric, and used for exactly the kind of jobs that Stone Age and early Bronze Age life demanded constantly. Nets for fishing, lines for hauling, simple garments for people who had not yet discovered the comfort of anything resembling a soft blanket. In other words, long before cannabis had a reputation, it had a job. It held things together literally. And it did this so effectively, across so many different early cultures independently, that by the time written history begins, the plant is already everywhere, already domesticated, already woven in every sense of the word, into the daily lives of people from the Yellow River Valley in the east to the edges of Europe in the west. Which raises an obvious question. How does a plant like this end up traveling so far, so early, without roads, without ships, without anything we would recognize as trade networks? The answer, as with most early plant migrations, is unglamorous. Cannabis is remarkably good at growing almost anywhere with reasonable sun and reasonable water. Its seeds are light and durable. Nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples moving across the vast belt of steppe that stretches from Mongolia to Eastern Europe would have carried it with them without even necessarily intending to. The same way certain seeds catch a ride on a sock or a sleeve today. Every time a group settled somewhere for a season, planted crops, moved on, and left disturbed soil behind, cannabis had another opportunity to take root and spread. It didn't need conquest. It didn't need trade agreements. It just needed people to keep being restless, which, historically, has never been in short supply. By the time we reach the threshold of recorded history, somewhere around 3000 BCE, cannabis is no longer a curious, half-understood accident. It's a fixture, a working plant. A plant with jobs to do and in certain corners of the world. A plant already beginning to whisper about something more, about the possibility that the fog it produced in the mind wasn't just confusion but a kind of doorway. And it's in one of those corners, along the banks of a certain great river in East Asia, where the plant would get its very first written endorsement. Not from a poet, not from a priest, but according to legend, from an emperor who made a habit of testing plants on himself to see which ones might kill him. Let's pick the story back up somewhere around 2700 BCE, in a region of the world that was already, at this point in history, quietly inventing the future. China. While much of the rest of humanity was still working out the basics of settled life, Chinese civilization was producing silk, refining bronze, developing early writing systems, and in a move that would matter a great deal to our story tonight, compiling some of the world's first organized medical knowledge. And at the center of that early medical tradition sits a figure who is part historical memory, part folklore, and entirely fascinating. Emperor Shen Nung, remembered in later texts as the divine farmer. According to legend, Shen Nung didn't rule the way most emperors ruled. He wasn't primarily interested in armies or monuments. His obsession, as the stories tell it, was plants specifically, figuring out which ones healed people and which ones killed them, using the most direct research method imaginable, eating them himself and taking careful notes on the results. It's a method that would never survive a modern ethics review board, but in a world without any organized pharmacology at all, it was arguably the only method available. Somebody had to be first. According to tradition, Shen Nung simply decided that somebody would be him. Through this long, slow, occasionally near-fatal process of trial and error, Shen Nung is credited with identifying hundreds of medicinal plants, laying the foundation for what would eventually become traditional Chinese medicine. Among the substances attributed to his catalog were ginseng, tea. Yes, the same tea millions of people now drink every morning without a second thought, and cannabis. His findings, whether compiled by Shen Nung himself or, more likely, gathered and written down generations later by scholars working in his name, eventually took written form in a text known as the Shenong Ben Cao Jiang, sometimes translated as the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica. It reads even today like an ancient medical reference guide, cataloging substances by their properties and their uses. What eased pain? What settled the stomach? What calmed a restless mind? Cannabis, in this early Chinese medical tradition, was recorded as useful for a fairly specific and fairly human list of complaints. Pain, inflammation, the kind of joint stiffness that comes from a lifetime of physical labor in a world without modern ergonomics, and intriguingly, memory and mental clarity, which is a detail that tends to get a small laugh from modern audiences, since cannabis is not exactly famous today for sharpening anyone's recall. But the ancient text wasn't necessarily contradicting itself. In small, carefully measured doses, integrated into broader herbal formulas rather than consumed on its own, the plant was believed to calm an overactive mind enough to let clearer thought take hold, less a matter of getting high, and more a matter of getting quiet. It's worth pausing here to make an important distinction, because it's one that will matter throughout tonight's story. Ancient Chinese use of cannabis was not primarily about intoxication. It was almost entirely medicinal and industrial, administered as part of broader herbal formulas, ground into powders, brewed into drinks, or applied as part of external treatments. The psychoactive properties of the plant were known. They don't disappear just because a culture chooses to focus elsewhere. But the primary cultural framework in ancient China treated cannabis the way we might treat a strong prescription medicine today. Useful, respected, and not something you casually shared at a dinner party, where cannabis really became inseparable from Chinese daily life, though wasn't in medicine cabinets. It was in hemp fields. Chinese farmers cultivated cannabis on an enormous scale for its fiber, and that fiber touched nearly every part of ordinary life. Rope, fishing nets, woven cloth for clothing, for sails, for sacks to carry grain. And in one of the more remarkable technological achievements of the ancient world, hemp fiber became one of the earliest materials used to produce paper, centuries before the more refined paper-making techniques traditionally credited to later Chinese inventors. Which means that some of humanity's very first written records, the scrolls that carried philosophy, poetry, government records, and medical texts like the one describing cannabis itself, were quite possibly written on paper made from the same plant they were describing. There's something almost poetic about that, a plant literally providing the surface on which its own history was first recorded. Within the framework of traditional Chinese medical philosophy, cannabis found a specific conceptual home. Chinese physicians of the era organized the body and its ailments around the balance of yin and yang, complementary forces that, when out of alignment, were believed to produce illness, restlessness, and disorder. Cannabis, understood as cooling and calming in nature, was seen as useful for correcting an excess of heat or agitation in the body. A fairly sophisticated, if unfamiliar, way of describing what we might today simply call a mild sedative effect. It's not a framework modern medicine would recognize, but it's worth remembering that this was a functioning, internally consistent medical system that had been refined and passed down for centuries, treating real patients with real, if incomplete, understanding. So while much of the rest of the ancient world was still working out basic survival, China had already folded cannabis into an organized system of medicine, agriculture, and early industry. It wasn't rebellious. It wasn't countercultural. It was simply one more useful plant in a very long list of useful plants, valued for practical reasons in a civilization that prized practicality above almost everything else. Shen Nung, whether he was a real historical ruler, a composite legendary figure, or something in between, gave cannabis its first documented medical reputation. And that reputation, pain relief, calming properties, careful medicinal respect, would echo forward through Chinese history for thousands of years afterward. But not every culture that encountered cannabis around this same broad era treated it with quite so much clinical restraint. A few thousand kilometers to the west, across the open grasslands of Central Asia, a very different group of people were doing something with this plant that had nothing to do with careful dosing or written medical texts, and everything to do with grief, ritual, and the kind of communal intensity that only nomadic warrior cultures seem able to produce. These were the Scythians. To understand the Scythians, it helps to picture a culture defined almost entirely by motion. They were horse-riding nomads who dominated the vast steppes stretching from the Black Sea region deep into Central Asia, roughly from around 900 BCE onward. They didn't build permanent cities in the way settled civilizations did. Their wealth was measured in horses, gold ornamentation, and military reputation. They were feared by neighboring settled peoples, admired by later historians for their craftsmanship, and remembered, among other things, for burial practices so elaborate that some of the richest archaeological finds from the ancient world come from Scythian burial mounds, called kurgans, scattered across the steppe. Our best written account of Scythian cannabis use comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE. Herodotus was, by modern standards, an inconsistent source, part historian, part travel writer, part collector of second-hand rumors that he didn't always bother to verify. But on the subject of the Scythians and cannabis, archaeology has since backed up a surprising amount of what he described, which lends his account considerably more credibility than some of his more fantastical stories about giant ants guarding gold in India. According to Herodotus, the Scythians practiced a specific funerary ritual following the death of a king or a person of high status. Mourners would construct a small enclosed tent, propping up poles and draping heavy felt or woolen coverings over the frame to seal it completely. Inside this sealed space, they placed a container of red-hot stones. Then, they took handfuls of cannabis seeds and threw them directly onto the heated stones. The seeds, Herodotus wrote, produced smoke and vapor so thick and so effective that no Greek steam bath he had ever encountered could compare to it. The Scythians inside the tent, enveloped in this dense cannabis smoke, reportedly shouted and howled in what Herodotus described as ecstatic pleasure. This wasn't casual recreational use. It was a communal, ritualized experience tied directly to mourning and to honoring the dead, something closer to what we might now call a sweat lodge ceremony than anything resembling a modern smoking session. The intensity of it, sealed tents, red-hot stones, handfuls of seeds thrown on all at once, suggests an experience meant to be overwhelming, meant to push participants into an altered state powerful enough to feel like genuine communion with something beyond ordinary consciousness. Grief, in this context, wasn't something to be quietly endured. It was something to be smoked through together, as a group, until the boundary between the living and the dead felt a little thinner. For a long time, some modern historians treated Herodotus's account with skepticism, assuming it was exaggerated travel writer flourish. Then, in the 20th century, Soviet and later Russian archaeologists began excavating Scythian kurgans in Siberia, and the physical evidence started catching up to the ancient text. Excavations at sites in the Altai region, most famously the Prehistoric burial mounds, uncovered actual bronze censers and small tent-like frame structures containing charred cannabis seeds, essentially matching Herodotus's description with startling precision. In some burials, archaeologists found elaborate gold and bronze vessels that appear to have been specifically designed for this kind of ritual smoke ceremony. Evidence that this practice wasn't a minor, isolated habit, but an established and valued part of Scythian spiritual and funerary life, important enough to be buried alongside the dead they were meant to honor. It's worth taking a moment to appreciate how differently two ancient cultures, existing at roughly the same broad period of history, chose to relate to the exact same plant. In China, cannabis was catalogued, measured, and folded into a system of careful medical theory. On the Scythian steppe, it was thrown by the handful onto burning stones inside a sealed tent, consumed communally and immediately, in service of grief and spiritual transcendence rather than physical healing. Same plant. Completely different relationship. And this pattern, cannabis being endlessly reshaped by whichever culture happens to encounter it, is going to repeat itself again and again as our story moves forward tonight, into India, into Persia, and eventually across the entire ancient world. Because the truth is, cannabis never really had one single identity in antiquity. It was medicine in one river valley and a bridge to the spirit world on the open steppe a few thousand kilometers away. It held ships together in one civilization and started sacred conversations with the dead in another. And as trade routes slowly began stitching these separate ancient worlds together, all of these different relationships with the same plant were about to start blending, spreading, and colliding, starting with a civilization that would take cannabis somewhere no one else had taken it yet, straight into the heart of its religion. That's where we're headed next, into ancient India, and the story of a god who is still, to this day, remembered as the Lord of Bhang. If China gave cannabis its medical credentials, and the Scythians gave it a role in mourning the dead, then ancient India did something no other civilization had quite done before. It gave cannabis a place in scripture, somewhere around 1500 to 1000 BCE, in the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent. A body of sacred texts was taking shape that would go on to become foundational to Hindu religious tradition. Among these texts is the Atharva Veda, one of the four principal Vedas, a collection of hymns, rituals, and spiritual knowledge compiled over generations. And within its verses, cannabis, referred to in Sanskrit as bhanga, is named as one of 5 sacred plants, described as a source of happiness, a joy giver, and a liberator, said to have been given to humanity as a gift from the heavens. That's a remarkable status for a plant to hold. This wasn't a footnote or a passing herbal remedy tucked into a medical appendix. This was scripture placing cannabis alongside the most spiritually significant plants known to the culture, treating it as something handed down by the divine rather than something merely discovered by trial and error. And at the center of this sacred association sits one of Hinduism's most important deities, Shiva. Shiva occupies a particular role within the Hindu pantheon as the great ascetic, the meditator, the god most associated with detachment from worldly concerns and immersion in deep contemplative states. According to popular legend and later devotional tradition, cannabis became closely associated with Shiva precisely because of this connection to meditation and altered consciousness. Various stories describe Shiva retreating into the wilderness, discovering the cannabis plant, and consuming it, entering into a profound meditative state as a result. From this association, Shiva came to be known by an epithet that persists in Indian religious culture to this day, Lord of Bhang. It's worth pausing on how genuinely unusual this is in the broader context of world religious history. Plenty of ancient cultures used psychoactive substances in religious ritual. We've already seen the Scythians doing exactly that. But India didn't just use cannabis in ritual. It wove the plant directly into its theology, associating it permanently with one of its most significant and enduring deities, a god still worshipped by hundreds of millions of people today. That association hasn't faded with time the way so many other ancient religious details have. It has survived, essentially intact, for roughly 3,000 years. The primary method of consumption in ancient India wasn't smoking, at least not initially. It was drinking. Bhang, prepared as an edible or drinkable preparation, was traditionally made by grinding cannabis leaves and buds into a paste, then blending that paste with milk, ghee, various warming spices such as cardamom, black pepper, and fennel, and sometimes sweeteners. The result was closer to a spiced, milky beverage than anything resembling modern cannabis consumption, something you might describe, with only mild exaggeration, as history's earliest cannabis smoothie. It was consumed by priests during religious observances, by ordinary worshippers during festivals, and by ascetics seeking a deeper connection to meditative states. The most significant festival associated with this tradition, and one that continues to this day, is Mahashivaratri, the Great Night of Shiva, an annual celebration devoted specifically to Shiva. During this festival, devotees traditionally stay awake through the night, chanting hymns, performing rituals, fasting, and in many regions of India, consuming bhang as part of the celebration, understood not as an act of rebellion or escapism, but as a way of drawing closer to Shiva's own meditative, transcendent state. It's a striking contrast to how cannabis would later be treated in many parts of the world. Here, In one of humanity's oldest continuously practiced religious traditions, communal cannabis consumption wasn't hidden or shameful. It was, and in many communities still is, an accepted and even celebrated part of religious devotion. This didn't mean ancient Indian society viewed cannabis as harmless in every context, or used it without any structure at all. Ayurvedic medical texts, developing alongside and sometimes overlapping with religious tradition, cataloged cannabis among a range of medicinal substances, recommending it for specific ailments, pain, certain digestive issues, appetite stimulation, while also cautioning against excessive or careless use. The framework was one of respect rather than either total permissiveness or total prohibition. A powerful substance, sacred in its origins, useful in its applications, but requiring the same kind of careful handling any powerful substance demands. What's particularly notable about India's relationship with cannabis, especially when compared with the civilizations we've already discussed tonight, is the sheer emotional range it was permitted to occupy. In China, cannabis lived primarily in the world of careful medical formulas. On the Scythian steppe, it lived in the intense, singular context of funerary grief. In India, it stretched across an enormous spectrum: sacred ritual, joyful festival celebration, medicinal treatment, and quiet, individual meditation, all at once. It wasn't compartmentalized into a single narrow use case. It was simply, openly, part of life, threaded through religious devotion, communal celebration, and personal healing all at the same time. None of this means ancient India treated cannabis as purely recreational in any modern sense. The concept of recreational drug use, separated entirely from spiritual or medicinal context, wasn't really how ancient societies framed intoxication in general. But it does mean that, uniquely among the ancient civilizations we've explored so far tonight, India gave cannabis explicit permission to produce joy. Not just physical relief, not just spiritual communion with the dead. Joy specifically, openly, without needing to disguise it as something more solemn. And this framework, established roughly 3,000 years ago, has shown remarkable staying power. Bhang remains legal and culturally significant in parts of modern India today, particularly during festivals like Holi and Mahashivaratri, where it's still prepared largely according to methods that would be recognizable to someone from the Vedic period. Milk, spices, ground cannabis, shared communally among friends and family as part of celebration. It's one of the longest continuously practiced traditions involving this plant anywhere in the world, a direct thread connecting a modern Indian family preparing Bhang for a spring festival to worshippers doing much the same thing 3 millennia ago. As cannabis's reputation as a joyful, sacred substance was taking root in India, its older, more solemn identity was continuing to deepen back in China, not in the practical, measured world of Shen Nung's medical catalog this time, but in a very different corner of Chinese spiritual life, the mystical, meditative, occasionally quite strange world of Taoist ritual practice, where monks were using cannabis smoke in pursuit of something considerably more ambitious than pain relief. They were trying to see the future. Let's return to China, but to a very different corner of Chinese civilization than the one we visited with Shen Nung. By roughly 1000 BCE, and continuing to develop over the following centuries, a distinct spiritual and philosophical tradition was taking shape alongside the more practical, state-oriented Confucian worldview that would come to dominate Chinese governance and social order. This was Taoism, a tradition concerned less with social hierarchy and proper conduct, and considerably more with mysticism, alchemy, longevity, and the pursuit of direct communion with the underlying forces of the universe. Taoist practice, particularly among its more mystically inclined monks and hermits, involved a wide range of techniques aimed at transcending ordinary consciousness. Meditation, controlled breathing exercises, elaborate alchemical experiments, some involving genuinely dangerous substances, in pursuit of physical immortality, And according to surviving Taoist texts, cannabis incense, burned specifically as part of ritual practice intended to open perception beyond the ordinary five senses. Some Taoist writings from this period describe cannabis smoke as useful for communicating with spirits, and even for gaining glimpses of future events, a considerably more ambitious application than anything we've encountered in this story so far. This wasn't about physical healing or communal joy. It was about using an altered state of consciousness as a genuine spiritual technology, a tool for perceiving realities that Taoist cosmology held to exist beyond the reach of ordinary waking awareness. Certain texts referred to cannabis in strikingly poetic terms, associating it with liberation from spiritual burden, and with opening what later traditions might describe as gates of deeper perception. It's worth noting that Taoist use of cannabis in this context appears to have been relatively controlled and ritualized, rather than casual. Monks burned it during specific meditative practices, often combined with other herbs and incense, following established procedures rather than simply consuming it freely. This fits a broader pattern we'll see repeated throughout much of ancient and classical history. Cultures that valued cannabis for its mind-altering properties tended to surround its use with structure, ritual, and intention, treating it as something closer to a spiritual tool than a casual pleasure. This mystical use of cannabis existed in a kind of quiet tension with the more dominant Confucian philosophical tradition in Chinese society, which prized social order, moderation, self-discipline, and skepticism toward anything that loosened one's grip on rational, controlled behavior. Confucian scholars generally viewed practices that induced altered states of consciousness with suspicion, associating them with laziness, disorder, or a dangerous abandonment of proper social responsibility. This tension between Taoist mysticism and Confucian pragmatism represents one of the earliest recorded examples of a debate that would echo throughout human history in many different forms. A disagreement over whether altering one's consciousness represents a path toward deeper truth, or simply an excuse to avoid one's obligations. Neither side fully won this argument in ancient China, and neither side has fully won it anywhere else in the thousands of years since. Instead, both traditions persisted side by side, Taoist mystics continuing their rituals in mountain retreats and quiet temples, Confucian scholars continuing to write their skeptical commentaries, and Chinese society as a whole continuing to make room for both perspectives, without fully resolving the underlying disagreement. But while these philosophical debates were unfolding in temples and scholarly circles, cannabis was living an entirely different, far less contested life across the wider expanse of Chinese society, not as medicine, and not as a spiritual tool, but as one of the single most important agricultural and industrial materials available to the ancient world. It's difficult to overstate just how central hemp fiber was to daily life in ancient China, and indeed across much of ancient Eurasia. Hemp grew quickly, required relatively little specialized cultivation, and produced remarkably strong, durable fiber that could be processed into an enormous range of practical materials. Rope made from hemp fiber was stronger and more resistant to water damage than rope made from many other available plant fibers, making it invaluable for everything from basic construction to fishing to, eventually, naval rigging. Cloth woven from hemp, while considerably coarser than silk, was durable, breathable, and accessible to ordinary people in a way that silk, reserved largely for the wealthy and the aristocratic, simply was not. And then there was paper. The traditional narrative credits the Chinese court official Kai Lun with formally inventing modern papermaking techniques around 105 CE, refining a process that would eventually spread throughout the ancient and medieval world. But archaeological evidence has since revealed that paper-like material, made significantly from hemp fiber, was already in limited use in China centuries before Kai Lun's refinements, meaning that hemp doesn't just intersect with the story of ancient Chinese writing and record-keeping. In a very real sense, it helped make that writing possible in the first place. Some of the earliest medical texts describing cannabis's properties may well have been recorded on paper made partly from the very plant they were describing. A small, quiet irony that historians still find worth mentioning. This practical, industrial relationship with cannabis wasn't unique to China. As trade routes gradually connected different regions of the ancient world, hemp cultivation and hemp fiber use spread outward, adopted by cultures for reasons that had nothing to do with intoxication and everything to do with basic material necessity. Ropes, nets, sails, and textiles made from hemp began appearing across Persia, the eastern Mediterranean, and eventually deeper into Europe, carried along the same slow, informal trade networks that moved silk, spices, and countless other goods across the ancient world. By the time we reach the classical era, Persia's great empires, Greece's philosophical Golden Age, and Rome's expanding republic and eventual empire, cannabis had already established two entirely separate, parallel identities that would continue traveling together. Sometimes overlapping, sometimes staying carefully apart. On one hand, it was a plant of genuine spiritual and medicinal significance, capable of altering consciousness, easing pain, and connecting communities to grief, celebration, or the divine. On the other hand, it was simply useful, a reliable, unglamorous source of some of the strongest natural fiber available anywhere on Earth, quietly holding together the ropes, sails, and fabrics of civilizations that had no particular interest in its more mystical properties at all. It's this second identity, cannabis's pure practical utility, that would carry the plant westward next into Persia, where it would collide with a culture defined by its own distinctive relationship to fire, philosophy, and the divine. Zoroastrian priests, fire altars, existential questions about the nature of good and evil, and threaded quietly through all of it, cannabis smoke, believed by some to carry prayers directly toward the heavens. By the time cannabis drifted into the ancient Persian world, it arrived carrying centuries of accumulated reputation. It had already been medicine in China, sacred scripture in India, and a vehicle for grief on the Scythian steppe. And Persia, sitting at the crossroads of so many of these overlapping cultural currents, was about to add its own distinctive layer to the plant's evolving identity: philosophy. The earliest clear textual reference to cannabis use in the broader Mesopotamian and Persian world actually comes from the Assyrians, whose written records refer to the plant using a term, quinubu, that many linguists believe is directly related to the word cannabis itself, and possibly to the Hebrew term found in some biblical scholarship as well. Assyrian priests are recorded burning it in temple contexts, not for casual enjoyment, but specifically in pursuit of religious insight. A practice that fits neatly into the broader pattern we've already seen across multiple ancient cultures, where the smoke of this plant was consistently associated with a thinning of the boundary between ordinary human perception and something considered divine. When cannabis use spread into the broader Persian cultural sphere, it found particularly fertile ground among adherents of Zoroastrianism, one of the ancient world's most influential religious traditions, centered on the worship of Ahura Mazda and organized around a cosmic struggle between forces of truth and light on one side, and deception and darkness on the other. Zoroastrian religious practice placed enormous emphasis on fire as a sacred, purifying element, maintained continuously in specially designated fire temples. It's not difficult to see how a substance that produced fragrant smoke, believed to carry prayer and intention upward, would find a natural home within a religious framework already so deeply organized around fire and its symbolic power. Some historical accounts suggest that Zoroastrian priests incorporated cannabis, sometimes alongside other aromatic and psychoactive plants, into specific ritual contexts intended to induce states conducive to religious insight or prophetic vision. The details here are considerably less well documented than, say, the Indian Bhang tradition or the Scythian funerary practice. Zoroastrian textual sources are fragmentary, and much of what survives was written down centuries after the practices themselves would have been most active. But the general pattern is consistent with what we've already seen. A substance capable of altering ordinary consciousness, deployed carefully and specifically within an established religious framework, understood not as recreation, but as a tool for approaching the divine. Persia in this era was also, quite famously, a civilization deeply invested in philosophical and metaphysical inquiry, producing thinkers and religious scholars who spent enormous energy debating the nature of good and evil, the structure of the cosmos, and the proper relationship between human beings and the divine order. It's easy to imagine, even if the specific historical record is thin on this exact point, how a substance already associated with insight and altered perception might have found its way into these broader philosophical and religious conversations, valued not for producing entertainment, but for softening the rigid edges of ordinary thought long enough to let unconventional ideas take shape. This pattern, cannabis providing a kind of philosophical lubricant, easing minds into more expansive or unconventional modes of thinking, is one we'll see again and again as our story moves westward. But it's worth pausing here to note an important and recurring theme in the ancient history of this plant. Wherever cannabis offered ordinary people a route towards spiritual insight or altered perception that didn't require the mediation of official religious or political authority, those same authorities tended to respond with considerable unease. This dynamic appears to have played out, at least to some degree, in the Persian context as well. As cannabis use spread among certain religious mystics and ordinary practitioners seeking direct spiritual experience, more formal religious and political authorities grew increasingly wary. A population capable of accessing profound spiritual states without needing to pass through official priestly channels represented, at least implicitly, a kind of threat to established religious hierarchy. This isn't a uniquely Persian phenomenon. We'll see remarkably similar tensions play out later in the Islamic world, and later still in medieval Christian Europe. But Persia offers one of the earliest clear examples of a pattern that would repeat itself across cultures and centuries. Cannabis respected and valued in private, quietly regulated or discouraged in public, existing in a kind of permanent gray area between sanctioned religious tool and suspicious, unsupervised substance. Trade, meanwhile, continued doing what trade always does, moving goods, ideas, and plants steadily westward, along the network of routes that connected Persia to the broader Mediterranean world. Persian merchants and travelers, operating along early trade corridors that would eventually mature into the fuller Silk Road network centuries later, carried cannabis and knowledge of its uses further west, toward the eastern Mediterranean, and eventually into contact with Greek civilization. By the time cannabis's reputation reached Greece, it arrived as something considerably more complex than a simple agricultural commodity. It came as a plant already associated with medicine in China, sacred joy in India, ritual mourning among the Scythians, mystical insight in Taoist China, and philosophical and religious contemplation in Persia. It was, in other words, no longer just a plant. It had become, quite literally, a well-traveled idea. Arriving in the intellectual capital of the ancient Western world with a resume that few other botanical substances could match. And Greece, a civilization that never encountered an idea it didn't immediately want to categorize, debate, and write extensively about, was about to do exactly that. Ancient Greece, by the time cannabis arrived on its cultural doorstep, had already built an entire civilization around two closely related national obsessions: relentless intellectual debate and equally relentless wine consumption. It's almost fitting, then, that a plant capable of encouraging both introspection and a certain loosening of inhibition would find a comfortable, if not particularly prominent, place within Greek society. Unlike India or Persia, Greece didn't build religious devotion around cannabis, and unlike the Scythians, it didn't build elaborate funerary ritual around it either. Instead, true to form, Greek civilization did what it did with almost everything it encountered. It examined cannabis, documented it, debated its properties, and folded it into an emerging body of formal medical literature that would go on to influence Western medicine for well over 1,000 years afterward. Our clearest evidence for Greek engagement with cannabis comes from the medical tradition associated with Hippocrates, often remembered as the father of Western medicine, and later from the pharmacological writings of Dioscorides, a Greek physician whose work would go on to shape medical practice across the Mediterranean world for centuries, including well into the Roman era. Dioscorides, in his influential pharmacological text De Materia Medica, describes cannabis and its various preparations, noting its usefulness for treating earaches, inflammation, and general pain. He also makes note of cannabis seeds' effect of reducing sexual desire when consumed in significant quantity, an observation that, whether entirely medically accurate or not, made its way into Greek and later Roman medical literature as an accepted piece of conventional wisdom. It's worth pausing to note how significant Dioscorides' work actually was. De Materia Medica wasn't a minor regional text. It became one of the most influential pharmacological references in the ancient and medieval world, copied, translated, and consulted by physicians across the Mediterranean, the Islamic world, and eventually medieval Europe for well over 1,000 years after it was first written. Which means that Dioscorides' brief, matter-of-fact description of cannabis as a legitimate medicinal plant traveled forward through an enormous span of human history, quietly shaping how generations of physicians across multiple civilizations understood and used the plant. Greek engagement with cannabis, though, wasn't purely clinical. Greek intellectual culture placed enormous value on the symposium, a formal gathering, usually involving wine, structured conversation, music, and extended philosophical debate among educated men reclining on couches, discussing everything from the nature of virtue to the proper structure of an ideal state. It's within this broader cultural context, a society that had already built an elaborate social ritual around altering perception through wine in pursuit of deeper conversation, that occasional historical references to cannabis or hashish-like preparations being used in similar contemplative settings begin to appear, though the evidence here is admittedly thinner and more circumstantial than the clear medical references found in writers like Dioscorides. What's more clearly documented is the way Greek writers engaged with cannabis use in other cultures, particularly the Scythians, whom the Greeks encountered directly through trade, warfare, and diplomatic contact along the northern edges of the Greek world. Herodotus's detailed account of Scythian funerary cannabis rituals, which we explored earlier in tonight's story, represents exactly this kind of engagement. A Greek historian, writing for a Greek audience, describing a foreign culture's relationship with a plant that Greek civilization itself was only beginning to fully understand. Greek writers tended to treat these accounts with a certain intellectual curiosity mixed with mild condescension, admiring the exoticism of foreign practices, while maintaining a comfortable sense of Greek cultural and philosophical superiority. This tension, intellectual curiosity about altered states of consciousness, combined with a certain reluctance to fully embrace them as a legitimate part of respectable Greek civic life, reflects a broader pattern in how Greek society approached questions of intoxication and altered perception generally. Wine was woven deeply into Greek religious, social, and civic life, celebrated in mythology through the figure of Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and ritual madness, and central to nearly every important social and religious occasion. But Dionysian worship itself occupied an interesting, somewhat contested space within Greek religion, associated with ecstatic, boundary-dissolving experience, sometimes viewed with a degree of suspicion by more conservative civic and philosophical authorities, who worried about the social disorder that unrestrained ecstatic worship might produce. Cannabis, arriving into this already complicated cultural relationship with intoxication and altered states, never became as central to Greek religious or social life as wine did. It remained present, useful, documented in medical texts, and occasionally referenced in accounts of foreign cultures, but it never developed the kind of deep civic and religious infrastructure that wine possessed throughout the Greek world. It was known, respected in medical contexts, and occasionally regarded with the same mild curiosity Greek writers extended toward any foreign practice that seemed to offer a shortcut toward the kind of philosophical insight Greek thinkers spent entire lifetimes pursuing through argument and reason alone. From Greece, both the plant itself and the accumulated medical knowledge surrounding it were poised to make their next major journey, not northward or eastward this time, but south, across the Mediterranean, into a civilization that had already been quietly using cannabis for well over 1,000 years by this point, in a context entirely its own: the temples, tombs, and medical papyri of ancient Egypt. Egyptian civilization, by the time cannabis appears clearly in its written medical record, had already spent centuries perfecting one of the ancient world's most sophisticated approaches to medicine, mummification, and the careful, methodical treatment of the human body, both in life and in preparation for the afterlife. And it's within this uniquely Egyptian context, part medicine, part religious ritual, part preparation for eternity, that cannabis would find yet another distinct identity, one focused less on communal celebration or mystical insight, and considerably more on the practical, unglamorous business of relieving pain. By the time cannabis appears clearly in the Egyptian historical record, ancient Egyptian civilization had already been organizing itself around monumental construction, elaborate religious bureaucracy, and an enormously sophisticated body of practical medical knowledge for well over 1,000 years. Egypt was a civilization obsessed with order, permanence, and the careful maintenance of both the body and the soul, concerns that, as it turns out, made it a particularly receptive environment for a plant capable of easing physical suffering in a society that, for all its architectural glory, still had to contend with the very ordinary realities of pain, illness, and exhausting physical labor. Our clearest evidence for Egyptian cannabis use comes from the Ebers Papyrus, one of the most significant surviving medical texts from the ancient world, dating to roughly 1550 BCE, though likely compiling medical knowledge considerably older than the document itself. The Ebers Papyrus is an extensive compilation of remedies, diagnoses, and treatments covering an enormous range of ailments, and within its lengthy catalog, cannabis appears as a recommended treatment for several specific conditions: inflammation, general pain relief, certain eye conditions consistent with what we would now recognize as symptoms of glaucoma, and menstrual discomfort. This last application is particularly significant from a historical standpoint. Ancient Egyptian medical texts, including sections attributed specifically to gynecological and obstetric practice, reference cannabis preparations used to ease pain associated with childbirth and menstruation, administered by midwives operating within an already well-established, specialized medical tradition. Egyptian midwifery was a genuinely respected professional practice, staffed by women who possessed real, transmitted medical knowledge, operating in a world entirely without modern anesthesia, antiseptic technique, or any of the tools we now take for granted in managing the physical realities of childbirth. In that context, a plant capable of providing even modest pain relief represented something close to a genuine medical breakthrough, administered by professionals who understood its use within an established, if very different, framework of medical practice. Cannabis in ancient Egypt was primarily prepared and administered through topical applications, ointments, and oils, rather than smoked or consumed as a beverage in the way we've seen in India or among the Scythians. Ground plant material was mixed into carrier oils and applied directly to affected areas, or incorporated into more complex herbal preparations, combining multiple medicinal plants together. This method of use fits neatly within the broader pattern of ancient Egyptian medicine generally, which relied heavily on carefully compounded topical treatments, herbal poultices, and specific, methodical preparations rather than the ritualized inhalation practices we've seen in other ancient cultures. Religious and temple contexts also incorporated cannabis, primarily through incense. Egyptian religious practice placed enormous emphasis on fragrance and specifically prepared incense blends, believed to please the gods, purify sacred spaces, and, in certain ritual contexts, facilitate communication between priests and the divine. Cannabis, along with numerous other aromatic plant materials, appears to have been incorporated into some of these temple incense preparations, burned during specific rituals as part of a broader sensory and spiritual experience designed to create an appropriately sacred atmosphere within Egyptian temples. Perhaps most striking from a modern archaeological perspective is the evidence for cannabis's role in Egyptian funerary practice. Traces of cannabis have been identified in the wrappings and remains of several ancient Egyptian mummies, discovered through modern chemical analysis of preserved tissue and burial materials. This detail connects Egyptian practice to a theme we've already seen elsewhere in tonight's story: the presence of cannabis in burial contexts, suggesting that whatever value this plant held for the living, ancient Egyptians believed it retained some measure of that value for the dead as well, whether administered for pain relief during a person's final illness, or included as part of broader funerary preparation intended to ease the deceased's transition into the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian religious belief held that the afterlife represented a continuation of earthly existence rather than a complete departure from it, a place where the deceased would still require sustenance, comfort, and familiar tools and possessions. Tombs of wealthier Egyptians were routinely stocked with food, furniture, and personal belongings intended for use in this continued existence. Within that broader framework, the inclusion of cannabis, whether for its pain-relieving properties or its role in religious ritual, fits logically into a culture that took the practical needs of the afterlife every bit as seriously as the practical needs of ordinary daily life. Egyptian society was also notably a rigidly hierarchical civilization, and evidence suggests cannabis use crossed these social boundaries rather than remaining confined to a single class. Medical texts describing its use for general ailments suggest treatment available, at least in some form, to ordinary Egyptians experiencing everyday pain and illness. At the same time, historical and archaeological evidence also points to its use among Egyptian nobility, including suggestions that cannabis-infused preparations were used to relieve headaches and general discomfort among the ruling elite, individuals whose lives, for all their material privilege, were not exempt from the ordinary physical realities of pain and illness. What emerges from the Egyptian historical record, then, is a picture of cannabis functioning primarily as a practical medical tool, deeply integrated into an already sophisticated system of Egyptian medicine, while also carrying secondary religious and funerary significance consistent with Egypt's broader cultural preoccupation with the careful maintenance of both body and spirit, both in life and in the long journey believed to follow it. It wasn't treated with quite the same overt spiritual reverence we saw in India, nor with the intense ritualized intensity of Scythian funerary practice. It was instead folded into Egyptian civilization, the way so many useful things were folded into Egyptian civilization, methodically, practically, and with careful attention to proper application, consistent with a culture that approached nearly everything, from monumental architecture to the treatment of a headache, with the same underlying commitment to order and precision. From Egypt, cannabis's story continues to move around the ancient Mediterranean world, carried along expanding trade networks that connected Egypt, the Levant, Greece, and eventually the rising power of Rome into an increasingly interconnected commercial and cultural sphere. And it's in Rome, a civilization that approached nearly every foreign custom it encountered with a distinctive blend of practical adoption and moral suspicion, where cannabis would find yet another new identity, useful, widespread, medically respected, and yet, in typically Roman fashion, treated with a certain reflexive wariness whenever it threatened to become too enjoyable. By the time the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire rose to dominate the Mediterranean world, cannabis had already accumulated an extraordinarily long and varied resume. Chinese medicine, Indian scripture, Scythian ritual, Persian philosophy, Greek pharmacology, and Egyptian midwifery. Rome, characteristically, absorbed nearly all of these existing associations at once, the same way it absorbed gods, cuisines, and conquered peoples from every corner of its expanding territory, folding them into a distinctly Roman framework defined above all by practicality, and by a very particular, very Roman brand of moral suspicion toward pleasures that hadn't been properly taxed, regulated, or sanctioned by the state. Rome's most direct and immediate use of cannabis had nothing to do with medicine or ritual at all. It had to do with rope. The Roman military and merchant fleets, which by the height of the empire represented the largest and most sophisticated naval and logistical network the ancient Mediterranean world had ever seen, depended enormously on hemp fiber for cordage, rigging, and sailcloth. Hemp rope was strong, relatively resistant to the corrosive effects of salt water, and available in the enormous quantities that an empire of Rome's scale required. Without reliable, large-scale hemp cultivation and processing, the logistics of Roman naval power and Mediterranean trade would have looked considerably different. In a very real sense, the ships that carried Roman legions across the Mediterranean, and the trade vessels that kept the empire's vast urban populations fed and supplied, were held together, quite literally, by cannabis fiber. On the medical side, Roman physicians largely inherited and built upon the existing Greek medical tradition, and no figure looms larger in this transmission than Dioscorides, the same Greek physician whose pharmacological writings we discussed in the context of Greece. Dioscorides' work, composed during the early Roman imperial period, became a foundational medical reference not just in the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean, but throughout the entire Roman world, translated, copied, and consulted by physicians across the empire for centuries. Roman medical practice, following Dioscorides' guidance, recognized cannabis as useful for treating earaches, joint pain, and general inflammation, conditions that, given the physically demanding realities of Roman military service, manual labor, and simply living in a world without modern medicine, would have affected an enormous portion of the Roman population. Roman medical writers also noted, following earlier Greek observations, that cannabis seed preparations were believed to reduce sexual desire when consumed in significant quantities. This particular claim found its way into a range of Roman medical and even satirical writing, treated as accepted conventional wisdom regardless of how rigorously, or not, it had actually been tested. It's worth noting how persistent claims like this tend to be once they enter an authoritative medical text. Dioscorides' brief observation traveled forward through Roman medicine, and considerably further still, cited and recited by physicians for well over 1,000 years afterward. Roman women, according to surviving historical accounts, also made use of cannabis-infused oils and preparations for cosmetic and general health purposes, applying them as part of broader beauty and wellness routines that, given the genuinely difficult realities of Roman public sanitation, diet, and general health conditions, likely provided welcome relief regardless of the specific cosmetic claims attached to them. But here's where Roman attitudes toward cannabis take a genuinely distinctive turn, one that sets Rome apart from several of the cultures we've already explored tonight. Rome possessed a deeply ingrained cultural anxiety about intoxication, particularly intoxication that fell outside socially sanctioned, properly Roman contexts. Wine, consumed within the structured, hierarchical framework of Roman social dining, was considered civilized, appropriately masculine, and entirely acceptable, provided it was consumed according to established Roman social custom. Substances associated with foreign cultures, mystical practices, or altered states that fell outside this familiar framework, however, tended to be viewed with considerable suspicion, treated as markers of foreign decadence, effeminacy, or a dangerous loss of the disciplined self-control that Roman civic identity prized so highly. This meant that while hemp itself was ubiquitous throughout Roman society, present in rope, sailcloth, and medical preparations found in households across the empire, the specific act of consuming cannabis for its intoxicating properties remained something associated primarily with foreigners, mystics, and individuals operating outside the bounds of proper Roman social respectability. It's a genuinely interesting cultural split. The plant was everywhere, thoroughly integrated into Roman infrastructure and Roman medicine, and yet the specific behavior of getting intentionally intoxicated from it carried a distinct undertone of foreignness and mild social disgrace, reserved, in the Roman imagination, for the kind of person who talked too much about mysticism and not enough about proper civic duty. Rome's vast network of roads, trade routes, and military campaigns did more than perhaps any single force in the ancient world to physically spread hemp cultivation across an enormous geographic range. Roman soldiers, administrators, and merchants, moving across a territory that stretched from Britain in the northwest to the edges of Mesopotamia in the east, carried hemp seeds and cultivation knowledge with them, whether deliberately, for the plant's practical fiber applications, or simply as an incidental byproduct of Roman agricultural expansion into newly conquered provinces. By the height of the Roman Empire, hemp cultivation had taken root, quite literally, across an enormous swath of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, laying agricultural groundwork that would persist for centuries after Rome's political power had long since faded. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the strange duality of Rome's relationship with this plant. No civilization we've examined so far did more to physically spread cannabis cultivation across such an enormous geographic area, and few civilizations relied on its practical fiber applications quite so heavily for essential infrastructure like naval rigging and construction cordage. And yet Rome, for all this practical dependence, never developed anything resembling the open religious reverence India extended toward the plant, or even the more measured medical respect China maintained toward it. Rome used cannabis constantly, relied on it structurally, and quietly looked down on anyone who enjoyed it too openly. A contradiction that, as we'll see throughout the rest of tonight's story, would echo forward through an enormous number of civilizations still to come, right up through the modern era. As Roman political power eventually began its long, slow decline, the hemp fields, trade routes, and medical traditions it had helped establish across such a vast territory didn't disappear along with it. They persisted, quietly, quite literally growing wild in some regions, cultivated in others, waiting for the next great network of trade and exchange to pick up where Rome had left off. A network that was already beginning to take shape far to the east, along a series of interconnected caravan routes that would eventually become known, centuries later, as the Silk Road. As the great trade network historians would eventually name the Silk Road matured into its fullest form, roughly from the final centuries BCE through the height of its activity in the medieval period, cannabis found itself swept up into what might reasonably be called the ancient world's first genuine wave of cultural globalization. No single army carried it. No single empire claimed credit for it. It simply moved, the way trade goods and ideas always moved along these routes, passed from merchant to merchant, city to city, across a network stretching from the eastern edges of China all the way to the Mediterranean coast. The Silk Road was never really a single road at all. It was a sprawling, shifting web of overland caravan routes and connected sea lanes, linking Chinese silk producers to Central Asian oasis cities, Persian markets, Indian ports, and eventually Mediterranean trading centers controlled by various Greek, Roman, and later Byzantine and Islamic powers. Along this network traveled silk, spices, precious metals, ceramics, religious texts, philosophical ideas, and, quietly tucked among all of it, cannabis, along with the accumulated knowledge of its many different uses, gathered from every culture it had touched so far. What's particularly fascinating about cannabis's journey along the Silk Road is how thoroughly it had already been transformed by the time it reached any given new destination. A merchant carrying cannabis seeds or prepared cannabis products westward wasn't just carrying a plant. He was, in a sense, carrying an accumulated cultural history: Chinese medical theory, Indian religious association, Persian philosophical use, all traveling together, blending and reshaping themselves further with each new culture the trade routes touched. It's somewhere along this network, particularly as trade routes deepened contact between Persia, Central Asia, and the broader Islamic world beginning in the early medieval period, that a specific new form of cannabis consumption rose to particular prominence: hashish, a concentrated resin extracted from the cannabis plant, considerably more potent than raw plant material, and more easily transported, stored, and traded across long distances than bulkier plant matter. Hashish production appears to have developed and spread significantly within the medieval Islamic world, becoming, over the following centuries, one of the most widely consumed forms of cannabis across the Middle East, Persia, and parts of Central and South Asia. This transition toward more concentrated hashish preparations coincides with, and is closely connected to, one of the more colorful and historically consequential episodes in cannabis's long journey, a story that would eventually gift the English language one of its more startling etymological connections, linking a word we now associate with premeditated political murder directly back to this ancient, well-traveled plant. The story centers on a secretive religious and political sect known as the Nizari Ismailis, a branch of Shia Islam that rose to particular prominence in Persia and the Levant during the 11th and 12th centuries, under the leadership of a figure named Hassan Saba. Operating from a network of remote, heavily fortified mountain strongholds, the most famous being the fortress of Alamut in northern Persia, the Nizari Ismailis developed a reputation, largely through the accounts of their political enemies, for employing a very particular and very effective political tactic: targeted assassination of rival political and religious leaders, carried out by small, highly trained, fiercely loyal operatives. According to medieval chroniclers, many writing from considerable geographic and cultural distance, and often relying on second-hand or third-hand rumor rather than direct observation, these operatives were referred to as Hashashin, a term that later European writers, particularly Crusader-era chroniclers encountering these stories second-hand, would eventually adapt into the English word assassin. The popular medieval legend held that these operatives were given hashish before undertaking their missions, entering a kind of drug-induced state of fearless, blissful devotion that made them willing to carry out extraordinarily dangerous missions, confident that a paradise of pleasure awaited them regardless of the outcome. It's a genuinely compelling story, and it's one that has persisted in popular imagination for centuries, embedding itself so deeply into the English language that most people who use the word assassin today have no idea it's etymologically connected to cannabis at all. But it's also a story that modern historians treat with considerable, well-earned skepticism. The primary sources for this account come almost entirely from outside observers, particularly European chroniclers writing during and after the Crusades, who had every political and religious incentive to portray the Nizari Ismailis, a group that had proven remarkably effective at outmaneuvering far larger and more conventional military powers, as somehow deranged or drug-addled rather than simply well-organized, disciplined, and strategically effective. Modern historical scholarship generally regards the Nizari Ismailis as having been, in reality, a sophisticated political and religious community, notable for scholarship, diplomacy, library building, and careful strategic planning rather than drug-induced fanaticism. The hashish before assassination narrative appears to have functioned largely as a piece of medieval propaganda, a convenient explanation for enemies who found it easier to attribute the group's effectiveness to intoxicated fanaticism than to acknowledge genuine strategic and organizational skill. Whether any individual member of the group ever actually consumed hashish, whether before a mission or otherwise, remains genuinely unclear from the surviving historical record, but the broader legend of drug-fueled assassins almost certainly says considerably more about medieval European anxieties and rivalries than it does about actual Nizari Ismaili practice. Regardless of its accuracy, though, the legend proved remarkably durable, traveling back to Europe along with returning crusaders and merchants, embedding the word Hashashin and eventually assassin permanently into European languages, forever linking cannabis in the Western cultural imagination with images of secretive, drug-fueled political violence, an association that, as we'll see later in tonight's story, would echo forward for centuries, long after anyone still had any accurate memory of where the story had actually come from. Beyond this one famous and largely mythologized episode, the broader Silk Road trade in cannabis and hashish continued expanding steadily throughout the medieval period, carried by ordinary merchants pursuing entirely ordinary commercial motives, alongside silk, spices, and countless other goods. By the time cannabis and hashish had thoroughly established themselves throughout the Middle East, Persia, and Central Asia, they were poised to become deeply, and in many ways surprisingly, integrated into one of the medieval world's most sophisticated and intellectually vibrant civilizations. The Islamic Golden Age, a period defined by extraordinary achievement in science, medicine, philosophy, and the arts, and one that would develop its own remarkably complex and often contradictory relationship with cannabis and hashish. By the time the Islamic Golden Age reached its fullest flourishing, roughly from the 8th through the 13th centuries, spanning a vast civilization stretching from Spain in the west to Central Asia in the east, cannabis and its concentrated resin form, hashish, had become a quiet, complicated, and thoroughly embedded presence throughout much of the Islamic world. Present in medicine, present in mystical religious practice, and present, too, in ongoing legal and theological debate about exactly how it should be regarded. This was, by any measure, one of history's most extraordinary periods of intellectual achievement. Scholars working across the Islamic world made foundational contributions to mathematics, astronomy, optics, philosophy, and especially medicine, building on and substantially advancing the earlier Greek and Roman medical traditions we've already discussed tonight. Among the towering figures of this era were Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became one of the most influential medical texts in world history, studied in European universities for centuries afterward, and Abu Bakr al-Razi, known as Rhazes, another enormously influential physician and philosopher. Both Avicenna and al-Razi, along with numerous other physicians working across the Islamic medical tradition, wrote about cannabis within their broader medical works, generally describing it as useful for managing pain, aiding digestion, and calming an agitated or restless mind. This medical framing represents a fairly direct continuation of the Greek and Roman medical tradition established by writers like Dioscorides, whose works had been translated into Arabic and studied extensively by Islamic scholars, who then built upon, refined, and in many cases substantially expanded this earlier medical knowledge. The more complicated question facing the Islamic world wasn't cannabis's medical utility, which was broadly accepted, but its status regarding intoxication, a question with genuine religious and legal weight. Islamic law, drawing primarily from the Quran and the Hadith, the recorded sayings and practices attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, contains clear and explicit prohibition of khamr, generally understood to refer to alcoholic intoxicants, specifically wine. Cannabis, however, and specifically hashish, isn't explicitly named or addressed in the foundational religious texts, since it wasn't a substance in wide use in the specific place and time these texts were composed. This textual silence created genuine legal and theological ambiguity, one that Islamic scholars across different regions and different schools of religious jurisprudence approached in different ways over the following centuries. Some scholars argued that hashish, since it produced intoxicating effects broadly analogous to those produced by wine, should logically fall under the same religious prohibition, even without being explicitly named in Scripture. Other scholars took a more permissive view, arguing that since the text didn't explicitly prohibit it, and since it wasn't consumed in the same social and ritual context as wine, it existed in a genuinely different legal category. This disagreement was never fully or universally resolved, and different Islamic legal traditions, in different regions and different historical periods, arrived at different conclusions, ranging from strict prohibition to relatively tolerant accommodation. Within this legally ambiguous space, one particular religious and mystical tradition embraced cannabis and hashish with genuine enthusiasm. Sufism, the mystical branch of Islamic practice focused on achieving direct, personal, experiential union with the divine, often through practices including meditation, repetitive chanting known as dhikr, ecstatic movement and dance and poetry. Sufi mystics, operating somewhat outside the more formal, legalistic structures of mainstream Islamic religious authority, often viewed hashish as a legitimate tool for achieving the kind of altered, expanded consciousness they believed brought practitioners closer to direct experience of God. Several notable Sufi poets and mystical writers referenced cannabis and hashish favorably in their work, describing its use within specific mystical and devotional contexts as a genuine aid to spiritual practice, capable of quieting the distractions of ordinary consciousness and opening the practitioner to deeper states of contemplative awareness. This association between hashish and Sufi mystical practice persisted for centuries across various regions of the Islamic world, particularly in Persia, Egypt, and parts of the broader Ottoman territories in later centuries, becoming a genuinely established, if never entirely uncontroversial, feature of certain strands of Islamic mystical practice. Mainstream religious and political authorities, however, frequently viewed this Sufi enthusiasm for hashish with considerable suspicion, and at various points across different regions and different centuries, actively attempted to suppress it. Historical records describe periodic crackdowns on hashish consumption and hashish dens, particularly in major urban centers like Cairo and Baghdad, with religious authorities characterizing the substance as morally corrosive, associated with idleness, social disorder, and a dangerous abandonment of proper religious discipline and civic responsibility. These crackdowns, however, appear to have been consistently difficult to enforce and consistently temporary in their effects, with hashish consumption and hashish dens generally re-establishing themselves within a relatively short period after any given period of official suppression. This pattern official condemnation paired with persistent, widespread practical use and periodic, generally ineffective attempts at suppression, represents a genuinely important recurring theme that will echo forward through the remainder of tonight's story, appearing again and again across medieval Europe and eventually into the modern era. Authorities across an enormous range of different cultures, religions, and historical periods have repeatedly attempted to suppress cannabis use through moral condemnation and legal prohibition, and these attempts have repeatedly, consistently, proven only partially and temporarily effective, with the underlying practice persisting quietly, adapting to whatever restrictions were placed upon it, and generally re-emerging once enforcement attention shifted elsewhere. By the later centuries of the Islamic Golden Age, hashish had become, in the words of several modern historians studying this period, something close to an open secret across much of the urban Islamic world, officially condemned by religious and political authorities, actively consumed by segments of the population ranging from mystical poets to ordinary urban laborers, and existing in exactly the kind of legally ambiguous, culturally contested space that cannabis has occupied, in one form or another, across nearly every civilization we've explored so far tonight. As the Islamic Golden Age gradually gave way to new political configurations across the medieval Middle East, and as trade and cultural contact between the Islamic world and medieval Christian Europe intensified, particularly through the Crusades, returning European travelers, soldiers, and merchants would carry knowledge and rumors of hashish back to a European continent that had, up to this point in our story, remained largely on the periphery of cannabis's long historical journey. And Europe, as we're about to see, would respond to this new arrival with a very particular, very familiar mixture of fascination, moral panic, and quiet, persistent, unofficial use. By the time cannabis and knowledge of hashish began filtering into medieval Christian Europe, the continent had already developed, over centuries, a fairly consistent and predictable pattern for handling new and unfamiliar substances, ideas and practices arriving from beyond its borders. View them with suspicion, associate them with foreign or heretical influence, officially discourage or condemn them, and then, quietly, continue using whatever practical elements proved genuinely useful, regardless of what official religious authorities happen to say about them. It's important to draw a clear distinction here between two related but genuinely separate threads of cannabis's story in medieval Europe, because they unfolded quite differently. The first thread is hemp, the plant's fibrous, non-intoxicating agricultural form, which had already been cultivated across various parts of Europe since the Roman period, and which continued to be grown widely and without much controversy throughout the medieval era for entirely practical purposes. The second thread is cannabis as an intoxicant, whether smoked or consumed as hashish, a use that remained, for most of the medieval period, associated primarily with the distant Islamic world rather than with ordinary European practice. On the hemp side of the story, medieval European monasteries played a genuinely significant and somewhat underappreciated role. Monasteries across medieval Europe frequently maintained substantial hemp cultivation as part of their broader agricultural operations, using the fiber for rope, coarse cloth, and notably, for the production of parchment and paper used in the copying and preservation of religious and scholarly texts. There's a particular irony worth appreciating here, one that echoes the earlier Chinese connection between hemp paper and cannabis-related medical texts. Medieval monks, diligently copying religious manuscripts condemning worldly vice and moral corruption, were quite possibly doing so on paper produced from the very same plant that, in its other form, was beginning to draw increasingly nervous attention from religious authorities elsewhere in Europe. Medieval European medicine, meanwhile, continued to draw heavily on the classical medical tradition established by writers like Dioscorides, whose works, along with those of later Islamic physicians like Avicenna, were gradually reintroduced to European scholarly circles, particularly from the 12th century onward, through translation efforts centered in centers of cross-cultural scholarly exchange such as Spain and Sicily. Through these channels, European physicians and apothecaries gained renewed access to centuries of accumulated medical knowledge regarding cannabis, and began incorporating cannabis-based preparations into European medical practice, particularly for pain relief, and for what medieval medical texts often delicately referred to as women's complaints, a broad category covering various aspects of menstrual and reproductive health. This medical use, generally administered through oils, tinctures, and other topical or ingested preparations rather than smoking, existed in a relatively quiet, unremarkable corner of medieval medical practice throughout much of this period, generating considerably less controversy or attention than one might expect, largely because it didn't typically produce the kind of overt, socially visible intoxication associated with heavier hashish consumption. The more dramatic and more religiously fraught thread of the story involves the returning accounts of European crusaders and travelers, who, through direct or indirect contact with the Islamic world during the various crusades of the 11th through 13th centuries, encountered stories, and in some cases direct experience, of hashish use as practiced in the Middle East. These accounts, filtered back to Europe through often unreliable, second-hand, and culturally biased channels, tended to emphasize the most sensational and morally alarming aspects of what these travelers had witnessed or heard about: hashish dens filled with relaxed, seemingly contented people, entirely detached from what European Christian observers considered proper religious devotion and social discipline. It's worth remembering that this is also the same general historical period and cultural context that produced the famous, largely mythologized Hashashin legend we discussed earlier, the story linking hashish to the Nizari Ismaili assassins. These various threads, genuine medical knowledge, exaggerated tales of intoxicated hashish dens, and the sensational assassin legend arrived in Europe together, tangled up with one another, creating a European cultural impression of cannabis and hashish that leaned heavily toward the exotic, the dangerous, and the morally suspect, an impression considerably more negative and more fearful than the plant's actual historical reputation across most of the cultures it had touched up to this point. The medieval Christian Church, which held enormous authority over both spiritual and, to a considerable degree, medical and social life throughout much of medieval Europe, generally approached substances and practices associated with altered consciousness with deep suspicion, particularly when those substances or practices were also associated with foreign, non-Christian cultures. Anything that produced spiritual or mystical experience outside the sanctioned framework of Christian prayer, sacrament, and church authority was, at least potentially, viewed as spiritually dangerous, a possible avenue for demonic influence or heretical deviation from proper religious practice. Within this broader climate of religious caution, cannabis intoxication, associated as it was with the distant, non-Christian Islamic world, and further tainted by the sensational Hashashin legend, generally acquired a reputation in medieval European religious and popular thought as something foreign, faintly sinister, and certainly not appropriate for respectable Christian behavior. This didn't mean cannabis in its various forms disappeared from medieval European life. The hemp agricultural economy continued largely unaffected, and cannabis-based medical preparations continued to be used by physicians and apothecaries throughout the period. But it does mean that recreational or ritual intoxication using cannabis never developed anything resembling the open cultural acceptance it had achieved in places like India, or even the more complicated, contested tolerance it maintained in various corners of the medieval Islamic world. Instead, European engagement with cannabis throughout most of the medieval period settled into a familiar pattern, one we've already seen echo across multiple civilizations throughout tonight's story. quiet, practical agricultural use continuing largely without controversy, alongside a more contested, more suspicious relationship with the plant's intoxicating properties, generally associated with foreign influence, moral danger, and behavior falling outside the bounds of proper, sanctioned religious and social life. This particular configuration, hemp as unremarkable agricultural staple, cannabis intoxication as foreign and faintly suspect, would persist across much of Europe for centuries, gradually shifting and evolving as European exploration, colonization, and global trade networks began expanding dramatically outward from the late medieval period onward, bringing European sailors, merchants, and colonists into direct contact with cannabis use across an enormous range of new cultures and contexts around the rapidly globalizing early modern world. That's where we're headed next, into the age of exploration, when hemp quite literally helped carry European ships across oceans they had never before crossed, even as European colonial administrators began encountering and reacting to cannabis use among the very populations they were in the process of colonizing. As medieval Europe gave way to the Renaissance, and as European maritime powers began the long, ambitious process of exploring, charting, and eventually colonizing vast stretches of the globe, hemp quietly became one of the single most strategically important agricultural resources in Europe, in a way that had little to do with intoxication and everything to do with naval power. Wooden sailing ships of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries depended enormously on rope and canvas sailcloth, and hemp remained, throughout this entire period, the single best available material for both. A large sailing vessel of this era might require literally miles of hemp rope for rigging alone, along with vast quantities of hemp canvas for sails. European naval powers, recognizing this strategic dependency, actively encouraged, and in some cases legally mandated, hemp cultivation among their farming populations, understanding that national naval strength depended directly on a reliable domestic hemp supply. This is, quite genuinely, one of history's more underappreciated connections. The ships that carried Columbus across the Atlantic in 1492, and the ships that carried subsequent waves of European explorers, merchants, and colonists to the Americas, Africa, and Asia over the following centuries, were held together, rigged, and powered by sail made substantially from hemp fiber. In a very real, very literal sense, the entire European age of exploration, and the profound global transformations it set in motion, depended on cannabis cultivation on a massive agricultural scale. Not the intoxicating use of the plant, but its practical, fibrous, thoroughly unglamorous industrial application, quietly enabling some of the most consequential voyages in human history. As European powers established colonial territories across the Americas, Africa, and Asia over the following centuries, they carried hemp cultivation with them as a matter of practical agricultural policy, planting it wherever climate and soil conditions allowed, to help supply the enormous ongoing demand for rope and sailcloth back home. Spanish colonial administrators introduced hemp cultivation to various parts of the Americas. Portuguese traders and colonial administrators carried the plant to parts of Africa and Asia. English colonial authorities, particularly from the early 17th century onward, actively promoted, and at various points legally required, hemp cultivation among colonists in territories including early Virginia, recognizing the crop's strategic importance to English naval power. At the same time that this practical, agricultural spread of hemp was unfolding across the expanding colonial world, European traders, sailors, and colonial administrators were also, for the first time in a truly systematic and widespread way, coming into direct contact with cannabis intoxication practices among the diverse populations they encountered across their expanding colonial territories. In parts of Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, cultures that had, in many cases, been using cannabis for religious, medicinal, and recreational purposes for many centuries already, entirely independent of any European influence. European colonial reactions to these encounters varied considerably, generally following the same familiar pattern of moral suspicion mixed with practical curiosity that had characterized European engagement with cannabis intoxication since the Crusades. Colonial administrators frequently viewed local cannabis use among colonized populations with a mixture of anthropological curiosity and moral disapproval, often characterizing it, in reports and correspondence sent back to European authorities, as evidence of the supposed backwardness or moral laxity of the populations they were colonizing. A characterization that, it's worth noting clearly, says considerably more about European colonial attitudes and the broader ideological justifications colonial powers constructed to legitimize their own conquest and exploitation than it does about any genuine, objective assessment of cannabis use itself. Despite this general pattern of official colonial disapproval, cannabis use frequently persisted, and in some cases actually spread, within colonial territories throughout this period, sometimes adopted by European colonists and settlers themselves, despite official policy discouraging it, and sometimes maintained and adapted by colonized populations, as one among many forms of quiet cultural resistance to colonial authority and colonial cultural imposition. Meanwhile, back in Europe itself, the Renaissance period brought with it a renewed scholarly and scientific interest in classical medical texts, including the substantial body of ancient Greek and Roman writing on cannabis that we discussed earlier in tonight's story. Renaissance physicians and scholars, working within a broader intellectual movement that placed enormous value on recovering and building upon classical knowledge, revisited writers like Dioscorides with fresh scholarly attention, and cannabis-based medical preparations continued to hold a modest, generally uncontroversial place within European apothecary practice throughout this period, prescribed for pain, sleeplessness, and various other ailments, much as it had been throughout the medieval period before it. It's worth noting, with a bit of the same dry humor our story has carried throughout tonight, that this was also the same general period during which European society was busily developing an entirely different, and considerably more socially prominent, relationship with a very different intoxicant. Distilled spirits, and specifically the production and widespread consumption of gin, which exploded across parts of Europe, particularly England, from the late 17th century onward, creating social problems of a scale and visibility that cannabis, throughout this same period, never came close to approaching in European society. European moral anxiety about intoxication during this era, in other words, had considerably bigger and more immediate targets to worry about than a plant still primarily associated, in the European popular imagination, with the distant Islamic world and Crusader-era legend. By the time we reach the 18th and early 19th centuries, cannabis's story in Europe and its expanding colonial territories was poised to enter a genuinely new and significant phase, one driven by increasing direct European scientific and colonial engagement, with cannabis-using cultures in India specifically. Engagement that would eventually produce some of the most detailed and systematic Western scientific study of cannabis conducted up to that point in history. Even as the same period would also see cannabis beginning, for the first time, to enter fashionable and medical use within European society itself, particularly in Victorian England. The 19th century marks a genuine turning point in cannabis's long, winding story, because it's during this century, for really the first time, that cannabis moves from being a plant European society encountered occasionally through trade, colonial contact, and classical medical texts, into something considerably more immediate. A substance actively studied, prescribed, and consumed within European society itself, sitting quite literally in the medicine cabinets of respectable Victorian households. The pivotal figure in this transformation is a physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish doctor who spent considerable time working in colonial India during the 1830s, where he encountered cannabis use, and specifically its established medicinal applications within Indian Ayurvedic medical tradition, firsthand. O'Shaughnessy, unlike many of his European contemporaries, approached what he observed with genuine scientific curiosity rather than simple moral judgment, conducting systematic clinical trials on cannabis preparations, testing their effects on conditions including muscle spasms, convulsions associated with conditions like tetanus and epilepsy, and general pain management. O'Shaughnessy published his findings in the mid-1830s, and his work proved genuinely influential, helping introduce cannabis, in a considerably more systematic, clinically documented form than Europe had previously possessed, into mainstream Western medical practice. Following O'Shaughnessy's research, cannabis extracts and tinctures began appearing in pharmacies across Britain, and eventually across much of Europe and North America, prescribed by physicians for an extraordinarily wide range of conditions. Pain, muscle spasms, insomnia, migraines, and what Victorian medical literature frequently, and rather vaguely, termed nervous conditions or hysteria, a catch-all diagnostic category, applied disproportionately to women, that reflected the genuinely limited state of Victorian psychological and neurological understanding. Queen Victoria herself is popularly reported, based on the recollections of her personal physician, to have used cannabis preparations for menstrual pain, though the specific historical sourcing on this particular claim is somewhat less rigorously documented than one might hope, resting largely on second-hand accounts rather than direct primary evidence. True or not, the story reflects the broader reality that cannabis tinctures had, by the mid to late 19th century, become a genuinely unremarkable, respectable feature of mainstream Western medical practice, available without particular controversy or stigma, prescribed by physicians and purchased at ordinary pharmacies alongside countless other tinctures and patent medicines. It's worth placing this Victorian medical acceptance of cannabis within its broader pharmaceutical context, because Victorian medicine cabinets, by modern standards, were remarkably permissive places. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was extraordinarily widely used throughout Victorian society, available without prescription, consumed by adults and, troublingly by modern standards, sometimes administered to infants and young children to quiet them. Cocaine-based preparations, including the original formulation of a certain now globally famous soft drink, were marketed and sold openly. Against this backdrop, cannabis tincture was, relatively speaking, one of the milder and less controversial substances available in the Victorian pharmaceutical marketplace, its psychoactive properties genuinely acknowledged by physicians of the era, but generally regarded as manageable and therapeutically useful rather than alarming. At the same time that cannabis was quietly settling into mainstream Western medical practice, European colonial administrators, particularly within British-controlled India, were engaged in a considerably more anxious, more heavily scrutinized examination of cannabis use among colonized Indian populations, an examination that would eventually produce one of the most extensive and systematic official studies of cannabis ever conducted up to that point in world history. The Indian Hemp Drugs Commission, established by the British colonial government in 1893, the commission was formed largely in response to growing concern among British colonial authorities about the extent and social effects of cannabis use, in its various traditional Indian forms including Bhang, Ganja, and Charas, among the Indian population under British colonial administration. Over the course of an extraordinarily thorough investigation, the commission gathered testimony from thousands of witnesses across British India, including physicians, religious leaders, government officials, and ordinary cannabis users, examining questions of cannabis's effects on physical health, mental health, social behavior, and productivity. The Commission's final report, published in 1894, running to several thousand pages across multiple volumes, reached conclusions that were, particularly given the moral and political climate of the era, notably measured and comparatively restrained. The Commission found that moderate cannabis use, in its traditional Indian forms, did not appear to produce significant physical or mental harm for the vast majority of users, and specifically recommended against blanket prohibition, favoring instead a system of regulated taxation and controlled distribution, similar to the framework already being applied to alcohol within British colonial territories. This is a genuinely significant historical document, precisely because its comparatively measured, evidence-based conclusions stand in fairly sharp contrast to the much more alarmist, prohibition-oriented rhetoric that would come to dominate Western discourse around cannabis just a few decades later, particularly in the United States during the early 20th century, a shift in tone and approach that we'll examine in considerably more detail as tonight's story moves into its final chapters. Throughout the remainder of the 19th century, cannabis maintained this dual identity across the Western world, a genuinely respectable, if unremarkable, feature of mainstream medical practice in Europe and North America, prescribed by physicians for a wide range of conditions, while simultaneously remaining an object of considerable colonial scrutiny, anxiety, and cultural othering, wherever European colonial administrators encountered its traditional use among the populations they governed. This tension between cannabis as an accepted Western medicine and cannabis as a marker of colonial cultural difference requiring careful administrative management would carry forward, largely unresolved, into the early 20th century, a period that would ultimately transform cannabis's legal and cultural status far more dramatically and far more rapidly than anything that had come before it across its many thousands of years of documented human history. That's where we're headed next, into the early 20th century, and the beginning of the Prohibition era that would reshape cannabis's global legal status for the following 100 years. As the 20th century began, cannabis in the United States occupied roughly the same quiet, unremarkable medical niche it held throughout much of Europe. It was available in pharmacies, listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official reference guide for medicinal substances, and prescribed by physicians for pain, insomnia, and various other ailments, much as it had been throughout the Victorian era we just explored. Few Americans in 1900 would have regarded cannabis as a particularly alarming or controversial substance. That was about to change, and the reasons had considerably less to do with the plant's actual pharmacological effects than with a broader, more complicated story involving immigration, race, and the shifting political currents of early 20th century America. The specific word that would come to dominate American discourse around cannabis, marijuana, entered widespread American usage largely through its association with Mexican immigration. Following the upheaval of the Mexican Revolution beginning in 1910, a substantial wave of Mexican immigrants moved into the American Southwest, bringing with them, among countless other cultural practices, the recreational use of cannabis, generally smoked rather than consumed medicinally, a practice already established in parts of Mexico with its own independent history separate from the American medical cannabis tradition. American attitudes toward this new wave of immigration were, particularly in border states like Texas, frequently colored by considerable racial prejudice, and cannabis, closely associated in the popular and journalistic imagination of the period with Mexican immigrant communities specifically, became entangled with these broader anti-immigrant sentiments. Newspaper coverage throughout the 1910s and 1920s increasingly used the Mexican-derived term marijuana rather than the more clinical, pharmacologically established term cannabis, a linguistic shift that historians studying this period generally regard as a deliberate strategy, whether fully conscious or not, to distance the substance from its established, respectable medical reputation, and instead associate it with foreignness, criminality, and social danger. This period also saw growing negative attention directed at cannabis use within African American communities, particularly associated with jazz music culture in cities including New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. Newspaper and popular coverage of cannabis use within these communities frequently employed similarly racialized, alarmist language, often explicitly linking cannabis use to fears about interracial socializing, violence, and moral corruption, reflecting the broader racial anxieties that pervaded much of American society during this period. The single most influential figure in shaping American cannabis policy during this era was Harry J. Anslinger, appointed in 1930 as the first commissioner of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger proved to be an extraordinarily effective and dedicated bureaucratic campaigner against cannabis, and over the following years, he built and promoted a public narrative around the substance that bore only a loose relationship to the existing medical and scientific evidence of the period, an evidence base that, as we discussed with the 1894 Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report, had generally found cannabis's harms to be considerably more modest than popular fear suggested. Under Anslinger's leadership, and with considerable assistance from sympathetic newspaper coverage, particularly in publications controlled by media magnate William Randolph Hearst, American public discourse around cannabis during the 1930s took on an increasingly sensationalized, alarmist character. Cannabis was frequently portrayed in newspaper articles, official government statements, and popular culture, including a wave of moralistic films from this period, as an extraordinarily dangerous substance capable of inducing violent insanity, sexual depravity, and complete moral collapse, particularly when consumed by racial and ethnic minorities, whom this rhetoric frequently, explicitly targeted. The most famous cultural artifact from this era is the 1936 propaganda film often remembered today under the title Reefer Madness, though it was originally produced and distributed under other titles before being picked up and marketed under this now more familiar name. The film depicts cannabis use leading directly to hallucination, manslaughter, suicide, and complete moral ruin among a group of previously wholesome young American teenagers. Considered even by contemporary critics to be wildly inaccurate and melodramatically overwrought, the film nonetheless reflects, in a genuinely useful historical sense, the extraordinarily exaggerated public narrative that had come to surround cannabis by the mid-1930s, a narrative built considerably more on racial anxiety, immigration fear, and bureaucratic self-interest than on any careful, evidence-based assessment of the plant's actual effects. This campaign of sensationalized public messaging culminated in 1937 with the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act, federal legislation that, while not technically criminalizing cannabis outright, imposed such an onerous, deliberately impractical system of taxation and regulatory requirements on cannabis cultivation, sale, and medical prescription that it effectively eliminated legal cannabis commerce and legal medical cannabis prescription across the United States. The American Medical Association, notably, opposed the legislation at the time, with its legislative counsel testifying before Congress that the association found no reliable evidence supporting the alarmist claims being used to justify the law, and expressing specific concern about losing cannabis as a legitimate medical treatment option. This objection was, in the end, simply overridden. The passage of the Marijuana Tax Act effectively marked the end of cannabis's roughly century-long run as an accepted, unremarkable component of mainstream American medical practice, a status it had held since the Victorian-era medical developments we discussed in the previous chapter of tonight's story. From 1937 onward, Cannabis in the United States would exist primarily within an entirely different framework. Not medicine, but crime, not pharmacy, but prohibition. A framework that would shape American law, American culture, and eventually a considerable portion of global drug policy for the better part of the following century. It's worth pausing here to note the genuinely striking historical irony at the center of this chapter. The same plant that Chinese emperors cataloged as medicine, that Indian scripture declared a gift from the gods, that Egyptian midwives used to ease childbirth, and that Victorian physicians prescribed alongside countless other respectable tinctures, had, within the span of only a few decades in early 20th century America, been transformed almost entirely, in official government and popular discourse, into a symbol of criminality, racial menace, and moral collapse, not because the plant itself had changed in any meaningful pharmacological sense, but because the political, racial, and bureaucratic context surrounding it had changed dramatically. This newly established prohibitionist framework would remain largely unchallenged in the United States for several decades, hardening further in subsequent years, before eventually colliding, in the 1960s, with an entirely new generation of young Americans who would take cannabis, quite deliberately, and turn it into one of the most visible, most contested symbols of a sweeping cultural and generational rebellion. If the 1930s gave cannabis its criminal reputation in America, the 1950s and 1960s gave it a completely different, almost opposite cultural identity, a symbol of rebellion, of youthful defiance, and of an entire generation's rejection of the conservative, conformist values their parents had spent the post-war years carefully building. The seeds of this shift were planted, appropriately enough, in the beat literary movement of the 1950s. Writers including Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs wrote openly, sometimes explicitly, about cannabis and other drug use as part of a broader artistic and philosophical rejection of mainstream American conformity, consumerism, and social convention. Their work circulated widely among a small but culturally influential community of artists, poets, and intellectuals, planting an early association between cannabis use and countercultural, intellectually rebellious identity that would grow enormously over the following decade. That association exploded into full mainstream visibility during the 1960s, as cannabis became deeply, inseparably intertwined with the broader youth counterculture movement of the era, a movement that also encompassed opposition to the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, experimentation with Eastern religious and philosophical traditions, and a general, sweeping rejection of established social, sexual, and political norms. Cannabis use, once associated primarily in American public discourse with Mexican immigrant communities and jazz musicians, became, over the course of the 1960s, increasingly associated with white, middle-class college students and young people, a demographic shift that would eventually complicate the racially coded rhetoric that had originally been used to justify cannabis prohibition back in the 1930s. Cultural touchstones from this period, including major music festivals, the emergence of psychedelic rock, and countless works of literature, film, and visual art, cemented cannabis's status as a defining symbol of 1960s counterculture, representing, for many young Americans of the era, a rejection of what they viewed as their parents' rigid, hypocritical, and increasingly discredited social order. Particularly given the deepening controversy and moral questioning surrounding American involvement in Vietnam. This dramatic cultural shift did not go unnoticed by American political leadership, and it set the stage for one of the most consequential developments in the entire modern history of cannabis policy. President Richard Nixon's declaration in June 1971 of a national war on drugs, a sweeping policy initiative that would formally designate drug abuse, including cannabis use, as public enemy number one, and would dramatically escalate federal law enforcement resources, funding, and legal severity directed at drug offenses of all kinds. The following year, in 1972, Nixon's administration oversaw the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, which formally categorized cannabis as a Schedule I controlled substance, the most restrictive legal category available under federal law, reserved, according to the statute's own official criteria, for substances possessing a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety even under strict medical supervision. This Schedule I classification placed cannabis, at least in terms of formal federal legal categorization, in the same restrictive category as substances including heroin, and treated it as more strictly regulated, at least on paper, than substances including cocaine and methamphetamine, which were classified under the somewhat less restrictive Schedule II. This classification decision proved genuinely controversial even at the time it was made, and the controversy surrounding it has never entirely faded. Nixon's own presidentially appointed commission on the subject, formerly known as the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, and often referred to as the Schaefer Commission after its chairman, conducted an extensive, thorough review of the existing scientific evidence and ultimately recommended, in its 1972 report, that cannabis possession for personal use be decriminalized rather than treated as a serious criminal offense. Finding that the existing evidence did not support the severity of penalties then being applied, Nixon, despite having commissioned this very report, publicly rejected its central recommendations and proceeded with the strict Schedule I classification regardless. Decades later, in a detail that has become one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence regarding the political, rather than purely scientific motivations behind this era's drug policy, Nixon's own domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, gave an interview published years after Nixon's presidency had ended, in which he described the administration's drug policy as motivated significantly by a desire to disrupt and criminalize two specific political constituencies the Nixon administration regarded as hostile: the anti-war political left, closely associated in the public imagination with cannabis and psychedelic drug use, and Black Americans, who had become increasingly associated in public discourse, whether accurately or not, with heroin use. Ehrlichman's account, whether taken as a fully complete or entirely accurate historical explanation or not, has become an important and widely cited piece of evidence in ongoing historical and political debate about the actual motivations underlying early war on drugs policy. Whatever the precise mixture of motivations behind it, the practical effects of this early 1970s policy framework proved enormous and long-lasting. Federal and state law enforcement resources directed toward drug offenses, including cannabis possession and distribution, expanded dramatically over the following decades. Incarceration rates for drug offenses climbed sharply, with cannabis-related offenses representing a very substantial proportion of overall drug arrests throughout the following several decades. And these enforcement patterns fell, consistently and disproportionately, on Black and Hispanic communities. Despite research conducted throughout this period, consistently showing that cannabis use rates across different racial and ethnic groups in America were, in fact, relatively similar. This prohibitionist framework, established through the early 1970s legislation and enforcement priorities we've just discussed, would remain the dominant, largely unquestioned framework governing American cannabis policy for the following several decades, hardening further during the 1980s under the Reagan administration's own considerably expanded war on drugs initiatives, before finally beginning to show its first genuine cracks at the state level. Starting in the mid-1990s as a new medical cannabis movement and eventually a full legalization movement, began slowly, carefully, state by state, chipping away at the prohibitionist consensus that had held for so long. The 1980s brought, if anything, an intensification of the prohibitionist framework established under Nixon a decade earlier, driven by a new administration determined to demonstrate its toughness on drug policy, and by a broader national anxiety about drug use that had, by this point, expanded well beyond cannabis to encompass the genuinely devastating public health crisis unfolding around crack cocaine in American cities. President Ronald Reagan, along with First Lady Nancy Reagan, championed an approach to drug policy built around strict enforcement, harsh mandatory sentencing, and a highly visible public messaging campaign centered on the simple, memorable slogan, "Just say no," launched in the early 1980s as part of a broader effort to discourage drug experimentation among American youth through direct, moralistic public messaging, rather than through nuanced engagement with the actual pharmacological or social realities of different substances. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed by Congress with substantial bipartisan support amid growing public alarm over the crack cocaine epidemic, introduced a system of mandatory minimum prison sentences for a wide range of drug offenses, including cannabis cultivation and distribution offenses above certain quantity thresholds. This legislation, along with subsequent related laws passed over the following years, contributed significantly to a dramatic, sustained increase in American incarceration rates throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, with drug offenses, including a very substantial number of cannabis-related offenses, representing an increasingly large proportion of both federal and state prison populations. It's worth noting, as an important piece of historical context, that this era's policy framework often failed to meaningfully distinguish, in terms of public rhetoric and sometimes in terms of actual sentencing severity, between cannabis and considerably more dangerous substances involved in the era's genuine public health crises. This lack of distinction, critics have argued in the decades since, contributed to a broader erosion of public trust in official government drug messaging over time, as growing numbers of Americans, through personal experience or through the experiences of friends and family members, began to perceive a significant gap between cannabis's officially stated dangers and its observed real-world effects. Despite this hardening federal enforcement posture throughout the 1980s, a quieter parallel development was unfolding during this same period, one centered specifically on cannabis's genuine, well-documented medical applications with roots stretching back, as tonight's story has already explored at considerable length, through Victorian medicine, through the Islamic Golden Age, through ancient Egyptian midwifery, and all the way back to Shen Nung's earliest herbal catalog in ancient China. The specific catalyst for this renewed medical attention was the AIDS epidemic, which began devastating communities, particularly gay communities in cities including San Francisco and New York, beginning in the early 1980s. Patients suffering from AIDS-related wasting syndrome, along with the severe nausea frequently associated with the era's available HIV treatments, found that cannabis use provided genuine, meaningful relief from these specific symptoms, helping restore appetite and reduce nausea in ways that many patients and their physicians found considerably more effective than available pharmaceutical alternatives. This grassroots medical experience, combined with growing activism from patients, caregivers, and sympathetic physicians, gradually built political momentum toward formal medical cannabis legalization at the state level, a movement that achieved its first major breakthrough in California in 1996, with the passage of Proposition 215, formerly known as the Compassionate Use Act. This ballot initiative, approved directly by California voters, legalized cannabis use and cultivation for medical purposes under California state law, for patients with a physician's recommendation, covering conditions including AIDS-related symptoms, cancer, chronic pain, and several other qualifying conditions. California's 1996 medical cannabis law represented a genuinely significant crack in the previously near-uniform prohibitionist consensus that had dominated American cannabis policy since the early 1970s, and it proved considerably more consequential than a single state policy change might initially suggest, because it established a legal and political template that numerous other states would go on to follow over the following 2 decades. It's also worth noting the important legal tension this created, and which persists to the present day. California's medical cannabis legalization operated entirely at the state level, while cannabis remained, and remains, classified as a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law, creating an ongoing, genuinely complicated legal conflict between state and federal authority that would shape American cannabis policy debates for decades to come. Following California's lead, a growing number of additional states began passing their own medical cannabis legislation over the following years, through varying combinations of ballot initiatives and state legislative action, including Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Maine in 1998, and numerous additional states joining this list steadily throughout the 2000s. Each new state medical cannabis law generally built upon lessons learned from earlier state programs, gradually developing increasingly sophisticated regulatory frameworks governing medical cannabis cultivation, distribution, and patient access. This slow, state-by-state expansion of medical cannabis legalization throughout the late 1990s and 2000s occurred alongside, and was significantly reinforced by, a steadily growing body of formal scientific research into cannabis's pharmacology and its specific medical applications. Research that gradually built a considerably more detailed and nuanced scientific understanding of the plant's active compounds, an area of scientific inquiry that had, ironically, been significantly hampered for decades by cannabis's own Schedule I federal classification, which imposed substantial bureaucratic obstacles on researchers seeking to study the very substance that classification claimed had no accepted medical use. By the early 2010s, with a substantial and growing number of American states having established functioning medical cannabis programs, and with public opinion polling showing a steady, sustained, multi-decade shift toward greater public support for cannabis legalization more broadly, American cannabis policy stood poised for its next major transformation. Full legalization, not merely for medical purposes, but for adult recreational use entirely, a shift that would begin, quite literally, in the states of Colorado and Washington. In November of 2012, American cannabis policy crossed a threshold it had not crossed since the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, though this time it moved in precisely the opposite direction. Voters in Colorado and Washington state approved separate ballot initiatives, Amendment 64 in Colorado and Initiative 502 in Washington, legalizing cannabis not merely for medical use, but for recreational use by adults, establishing regulated systems for cultivation, retail sale, and taxation, operating entirely under state law, in direct and continuing tension with cannabis's unchanged federal Schedule I status. This was, by any reasonable historical measure, a genuinely remarkable development, and one worth pausing on for a moment within tonight's much longer story. For roughly 75 years, since 1937, cannabis had existed in the United States primarily within a framework of criminality and prohibition. Now, for the first time, American voters in 2 states had chosen, through direct democratic process, to establish a regulated, legal, taxed commercial market for recreational cannabis, treating it, at least at the state policy level, in a manner increasingly comparable to how American law had long treated alcohol. The federal government's response to this development proved, at least initially, notably restrained. In August 2013, the Department of Justice issued what became known as the Cole Memorandum, a formal policy guidance document indicating that federal prosecutors would generally decline to actively enforce federal cannabis prohibition against businesses and individuals operating in compliance with state-level legalization frameworks, provided those state programs met certain federal priorities, including preventing distribution to minors and preventing revenue from flowing to criminal organizations. This memorandum didn't change federal law in any formal sense, and cannabis remained federally illegal, but it established a period of relative federal forbearance that allowed Colorado and Washington's new legal markets to develop and operate with considerably reduced federal legal risk. Colorado's legal recreational cannabis market officially opened on January 1, 2014, and it drew enormous public attention, both within the United States and internationally, as one of the first fully regulated legal recreational cannabis markets established anywhere in the modern world. The early results of this experiment, studied closely by researchers, policymakers, and journalists alike, generally showed that many of the most severe predicted negative consequences, including dramatic increases in youth cannabis use or major spikes in cannabis-related crime, largely failed to materialize at the scale critics had warned of, though researchers have continued studying the more complex, longer-term public health and economic effects of legalization in considerable ongoing detail in the years since. Following Colorado and Washington's lead, additional states began passing their own recreational legalization measures over the following years, including Oregon and Alaska in 2014, and a substantial additional wave of states throughout the mid to late 2010s and into the 2020s, through a combination of ballot initiatives and state legislative action, gradually building toward a situation, by the mid-2020s, in which a majority of American states had established either medical or full recreational cannabis legalization, even as cannabis remained, throughout this entire period, formally classified as a Schedule I controlled substance under unchanged federal law. This growing patchwork of state-level legalization, existing alongside continued federal prohibition, created an increasingly complex, and by many accounts, increasingly unsustainable legal landscape, generating extensive ongoing debate among policymakers, legal scholars, and industry participants about the eventual need for some form of federal policy reform to resolve the widening gap between state and federal cannabis law. Alongside this rapid legal transformation, the scientific understanding of cannabis itself was also undergoing its own quiet revolution during these same decades, building on foundational discoveries made back in the 1960s and 1990s that had, for the first time in cannabis's many thousand-year history, begun to explain, at a precise biochemical level, exactly why this particular plant produces the effects it does on the human body and mind. The story of this scientific breakthrough centers substantially on the work of Israeli chemist Raphael Mechoulam, who, beginning in the early 1960s, led the research team that first successfully isolated and identified the precise chemical structure of tetrahydrocannabinol, commonly known as THC, the primary psychoactive compound responsible for cannabis's intoxicating effects. This was a genuinely landmark achievement in the plant's long scientific history, representing the first time researchers had precisely identified, at the molecular level, exactly what component of the plant was responsible for the effects that Scythian mourners, Indian worshippers, Chinese physicians, and countless other cultures across thousands of years of human history had all been experiencing, in their own very different cultural contexts, without ever fully understanding the underlying biochemistry involved. Mechoulam's research continued over the following decades, and in the early 1990s, his team, along with other researchers working in this expanding field, made a second, arguably even more significant discovery: the identification of the endocannabinoid system, a naturally occurring biological signaling system present in the human body, involving specific receptors, now known as CB1 and CB2 receptors, distributed throughout the brain and body, which interact directly with THC and other cannabis compounds. Even more remarkably, this research revealed that the human body naturally produces its own compounds, called endocannabinoids, that interact with these same receptor systems entirely independent of any cannabis consumption at all, playing important roles in regulating mood, appetite, pain sensation, memory, and numerous other basic physiological functions. This discovery represented a genuinely profound shift in scientific understanding, revealing that cannabis doesn't simply impose some entirely foreign chemical effect onto an unrelated biological system, but rather interacts with, and in some ways mimics, a naturally occurring regulatory system that the human body had been using for entirely unrelated internal purposes for the entire span of human evolutionary history. Long before anyone ever threw a handful of seeds onto a heated stone in a sealed Scythian tent, alongside THC, researchers also identified and began studying a second major cannabis compound, cannabidiol, commonly known as CBD, which, unlike THC, does not produce significant intoxicating psychoactive effects, but which research has increasingly shown to possess a range of potentially significant therapeutic properties of its own, including anti-inflammatory and anti-seizure effects. This research eventually contributed to the 2018 FDA approval of a CBD-based pharmaceutical medication for treating certain severe, difficult-to-control forms of childhood epilepsy, representing, in a genuinely notable historical sense, cannabis's formal, official return to recognized, federally sanctioned American medicine, roughly 80 years after the Marijuana Tax Act had effectively ended its previous long medical career. This growing scientific understanding of THC, CBD, and the broader endocannabinoid system has continued expanding rapidly in the years since, driving both ongoing legal reform efforts and a rapidly developing commercial industry built around cannabis's increasingly well-documented and well-understood therapeutic applications. Even as considerable scientific uncertainty and ongoing research remains regarding the plant's longer-term effects, optimal medical applications, and the specific risks associated with different patterns and methods of use, particularly among younger and still developing populations. As tonight's very long journey through cannabis's history approaches its final chapters, we find ourselves, in a sense, arriving back close to where we started, so many thousands of years ago, with a plant valued for its capacity to ease pain and alter consciousness, only now examined not through legend, ritual, and religious text, but through the precise, methodical tools of modern biochemistry and clinical science. That's where we're headed next, into cannabis's story on the global stage in the 21st century, and toward some closing reflections on this remarkably long, remarkably human journey. While the United States moved through its own particular, winding legal history over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, cannabis's legal and cultural status was, of course, evolving simultaneously across the rest of the globe, with different nations arriving at strikingly different policy conclusions, often shaped by their own distinct cultural histories with the plant, some of which, as tonight's story has already explored at considerable length, stretch back thousands of years longer than America's relatively brief and relatively recent engagement with cannabis. The Netherlands occupies a particularly well-known position in this global story, having developed, beginning in the 1970s, a distinctive policy of tolerance, sometimes described as decriminalization in practice, though not full legal legalization in a strict formal sense. Under this framework, formalized through official government policy guidelines beginning in 1976, the sale of small quantities of cannabis through licensed, regulated establishments, commonly known as coffee shops, was tolerated by Dutch authorities and effectively not prosecuted, even though cannabis technically remained illegal under formal Dutch law. This created a genuinely unusual legal arrangement. cannabis simultaneously illegal and openly, visibly sold, that became one of the most internationally recognized cannabis policy models in the world throughout the late 20th century, drawing enormous numbers of cannabis tourists to Amsterdam specifically over the following decades, even as the Dutch government has, in more recent years, worked to tighten and formalize various aspects of this system, particularly regarding the previously unregulated supply chain feeding into these officially tolerated retail establishments. Uruguay took a considerably more definitive legal step in December 2013, becoming the first country in the world to fully legalize cannabis for recreational use at the national level, establishing a government-regulated system covering cultivation, distribution, and sale, under which Uruguayan citizens could purchase cannabis through licensed pharmacies, grow limited quantities for personal use, or participate in registered cannabis growing clubs. This was a genuinely historic policy step, predating even Colorado and Washington's American state-level legalization by roughly a year, and it established Uruguay as an important early case study for researchers and policymakers studying the real-world effects of comprehensive national cannabis legalization. Canada followed with its own full national legalization in October 2018, becoming the second country, and by far the largest economy at that point, to establish comprehensive federal legalization of recreational cannabis through the Cannabis Act, which created a nationally regulated framework for cultivation, distribution, and retail sale, operating alongside provincial-level regulations governing specific retail and distribution details. Canada's legalization was particularly significant given the country's close economic and cultural ties to the United States, creating a genuinely unusual situation in which cannabis was fully, federally legal in one North American country, while remaining federally illegal, despite widespread state-level legalization, in its immediate southern neighbor. Portugal took a notably different, though related, policy approach beginning in 2001, decriminalizing personal possession and use of all drugs, not merely cannabis specifically, reclassifying personal drug possession from a criminal offense into an administrative violation, handled through a specialized panel process focused on health and social intervention rather than criminal prosecution. Portugal's approach, often cited internationally as a significant policy case study, was motivated primarily by a public health crisis involving heroin use during the 1990s, but its effects on cannabis policy specifically have also been closely studied, with subsequent research generally finding that Portugal's decriminalization did not produce the dramatic increases in drug use that critics had predicted. While contributing to improved public health outcomes across several measured categories, elsewhere around the world, cannabis policy throughout the early 21st century has continued evolving along a wide range of different paths. Germany moved toward a more limited legalization framework in 2024, permitting personal possession and cultivation under specific regulated conditions. Thailand, notably, briefly became the first Asian country to decriminalize cannabis in 2022, before subsequently moving to reintroduce more significant restrictions amid domestic political debate over the specifics of its regulatory framework. Meanwhile, many other nations, particularly across large parts of Asia and the Middle East, have maintained considerably stricter prohibition frameworks, in some cases retaining severe criminal penalties, including, in a small number of countries, capital punishment for serious cannabis trafficking offenses, reflecting the genuinely enormous range of different cultural, religious, and political relationships different modern societies continue to maintain with this plant. This tremendous global diversity in modern cannabis policy, from full national legalization in Uruguay and Canada, to tolerated but technically illegal sale in the Netherlands, to decriminalized personal use in Portugal, to continued severe criminal prohibition across large portions of Asia and the Middle East, reflects, in a genuinely striking way, a pattern that has actually persisted throughout nearly the entire multi-thousand-year story we've explored together tonight. Cannabis has never held one single, universal cultural or legal status across human civilization. It has always been simultaneously sacred and suspicious, medicinal and dangerous, respectable and criminal, depending entirely on which culture, which century, and which specific set of political and religious authorities happen to be examining it at any given historical moment. That pattern, remarkably, holds true right up to this present moment. In the summer of 2026, with cannabis's legal status continuing to shift and evolve across different American states and different nations around the world, even as scientific research into its precise effects, both therapeutic and potentially harmful, continues expanding and refining our understanding with each passing year. That's where we're headed next, into some final closing reflections, as tonight's very long journey through the history of cannabis finally draws toward its close. And so, after tonight's very long journey, stretching across roughly 7,000 years of human history, from a confused Stone Age forager accidentally inhaling smoke beside a campfire in Central Asia, all the way to modern legislative chambers debating regulatory frameworks and tax structures, we find ourselves finally approaching the end of cannabis's remarkably long, remarkably tangled relationship with our species. It's worth taking a moment, as we settle toward the close of tonight's story, to simply sit with how strange and how consistent this history actually is. We watched an emperor in ancient China catalog this plant as medicine, carefully measuring its properties alongside ginseng and tea. We watched nomadic warriors on the Central Asian steppe throw handfuls of its seeds onto burning stones, sealing themselves inside smoke-filled tents to grieve their dead. We watched an entire religious tradition in India declare it a gift from the heavens, associating it permanently with one of history's most enduring gods. We watched Egyptian midwives ease the pain of childbirth with it, Greek physicians catalog its properties alongside earaches and inflammation, and Roman sailors depend on its fiber to hold their entire naval empire together, even while quietly looking down on anyone who enjoyed its smoke too openly. We watched medieval Europe fear it, mostly because it arrived wrapped in stories of foreign assassins and hashish dens, stories built more on rumor and religious anxiety than on anything the plant itself had actually done. We watched it cross oceans, quite literally holding together the sails and rigging of the very ships that carried European explorers to the Americas. We watched Victorian physicians prescribe it beside countless other tinctures in ordinary, respectable pharmacies, only to watch America, within the span of a single human generation, transform it almost entirely into a symbol of criminality, tangled up with immigration fear and racial anxiety that had, in truth, very little to do with the plant itself. And we watched, in these more recent decades, an entire scientific field emerge from nothing, finally explaining, at the precise molecular level, why plant humans have been quietly consuming for 7,000 years produces the effects it does, revealing, in one of the more genuinely poetic twists in this whole long story, that the human body had been running its own version of this exact same chemical system all along, entirely independent of the plant, waiting patiently to be discovered. If there's a single thread running through all 7,000 years of this story, it might be this. Cannabis has never really been about the plant itself. It has always been a mirror, reflecting back whatever a given culture, in a given century, most needed or most feared. To grieving Scythian mourners, it was a bridge to the dead. To Vedic priests, it was divine joy. To Victorian doctors, it was ordinary medicine. To 1930s American bureaucrats, it was a convenient symbol for fears that were really about immigration and race. To a modern chronic pain patient, it might simply be relief, quietly purchased at a regulated dispensary, no different in principle from any other prescription. The plant itself, through all of this, has remained remarkably unchanged. It still grows in disturbed soil near human settlements, the way it did 7,000 years ago. it still produces the same handful of remarkable compounds, interacting with the same ancient biological system tucked inside every human body listening to this story right now. What has changed, over and over again, century after century, culture after culture, is simply us, our fears, our medicine, our religion, our politics, endlessly rewriting the meaning of the same quiet, stubborn, endlessly adaptable plant. Perhaps that's the most human part of this entire 7,000-year story. Not the plant at all, really, but our own endless need to explain it, to moralize about it, to fear it, to worship it, to tax it, to prohibit it. And then, eventually, in one culture after another, to quietly, gradually, make peace with it again. If you've made it this far into tonight's story, thank you for spending these long, quiet hours with me. If this kind of slow, detailed journey through history helps you unwind at the end of a long day, consider subscribing, so you don't miss whatever quiet corner of history we wander into next. And if you're still awake, drifting somewhere between listening and dreaming, that's exactly where tonight's story was always meant to leave you. Sleep well.